when you look at probate litigation, you'll find these three categories represent 85% easily of litigation in probate. And that's conflicts that existed already on the person who's deceased. Second is whether or not they had any conflict with the person who is deceased. They may have all loved the person who is deceased, but then there's conflict. And then finally, you have those third parties, those people who are not beneficiaries, which over time, there have been problems that developed, and those problems go straight into probate court when that person dies. So that is another area, substantial area of conflict that occurs in estate planning, and another thing you have to plan for and think about when you're doing your estate planning.
Welcome to Life's Third Act, an enlightening look at estate planning, retirement, and beyond.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. This will be part 3 of the episodes that we've done on Ivana Trump. Ivana Trump is a fascinating person that I think has gotten too little publicity, actually, but I understand there's Melania now, and of course, she's a very charismatic, beautiful lady. However, Ivana, the more that I found out about her, the more impressed and fascinating I found her. And I'll even go back a step and say that when I first saw the 3 Trump children, appear on stage, so to speak, as many people did see them together, and many of them at all for the first time when Trump was nominated or was running for president in 2016. And then, of course, when he was elected, they were all on stage in 2016, and then again, of course, in 2024. But it was, I have to tell you, I looked at these kids, the more I found out about them, Donald Jr., Eric, Ivanka, the more I was impressed with them. And I think much of America was. It doesn't mean that they're perfect, but, the mother of those children did a pretty good job.
Very strong lady.
And we are inclined, incidentally, to give most of that credit to Ivana. I mean, certainly Donald had a role, and I don't want to shortchange dads, but Ivana had custody of the kids. She got primary custody coming out of the divorce that was completed in 92. So
after she raised them, she was like, okay, college, and they're yours.
Yeah, famously, she said she handed them off after college and said, okay, my job's done now. Now they're yours.
My wife did the same thing. All the elementary school stuff, that was all hers. And now that they're in high school, she's like, all right, high school is your turn, college is your turn.
Well, look, if you do half as well as Donald did with his share, but as your example would suggest, I mean, those early years, and in this case, all the way through college, it's impressive.
Very.
And I think that Ivana was pretty low key, even though she was a strong personality and certainly a successful businesswoman, manager, as we've talked about in the previous episodes. But I don't think that she put herself out there like Trump. Of course, nobody puts themselves out there like Trump.
I mean, even though she had some books, she had, big time in the fashion industry. And I mean, she had her own column and shared a lot of information about divorce. But still, she was not in your face the way Donald has been in your face.
Yeah. So she was overshadowed. And part of that occurred, because there was a divorce and she was no longer the wife of Donald Trump. But we talked in the first 2 episodes about her background. We talked about her early life. The second episode, we talked about her career even after the divorce, how she continued to be a reasonably successful businesswoman. She had products and designs that were on clothing primarily, but also makeup and other things that were on QVC and the Home Shopping Network.
She was one of the first celebrities to do the QVC thing. Now they've all got their own perfume line and jewelry and makeup. So she kind of was a fashion first.
Really? I didn't know she was among the first to do that, but that does make sense. And she did lots of things. She invested in real estate. She made a lot of good decisions. Some of the businesses didn't thrive. She made money for a period of time, but then I think they kind of wound down on their own to some extent. So she didn't end up for the most part, she did not end up in those assets in her estate. She bought and sold real estate. I think that we told you that as part of the divorce, she was given this 45-room mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a very affluent area. Probably among the most affluent areas in zip codes, I suspect, in America. It has to be in the top 5.
She liked being, in that social circles.
She was.
The high end.
And they had, they had lived in and periodically in that house during the course of the marriage. What ended up being a 15-year marriage, but really 13 before the divorce was filed for in 1990. So she sells this 45-room mansion to, I think, the Steinbergs, a famous family. I think I see them sponsoring things on NPR or some other.
They've got some money, yes.
Yeah, they're prominent philanthropists, yes. And so they bought the property for, at the time, I think it was it $15 million?
Oh.
So it was
15.
15, and that was at a time when you didn't see a lot of real estate. Now we think 15 million is nothing because how crazy prices have gotten. But at the time, that was a big number for a piece of real estate. So I would say they sold that profitably. And here's what's really impressive. She turns around real shortly thereafter, like within 6 months, she bought a condo in New York on the Upper East Side, wonderful address, Central Park, and sells that in 17, I think. Now listen to this. She paid $2.5 million for it and sold it for, what, $26 million?
That's a good profit.
I mean, it's like tenfold. It's amazing what she did with that property.
And smart lady. I mean, she knew business.
Yeah. And there were a number of decisions she made that were very good. Of course, as we had talked in the second episode, she had experience running real estate, even running properties like hotels, Park Plaza. She ran that for a period of time. She was saddled with the casino on the boardwalk. And
it was more than just decorating the place.
Yeah. It was. She had some great challenges, and she learned a lot, no doubt, during the course of the marriage. And despite her humble beginnings, she ends up being this very talented business lady who's quite assertive and self-sufficient. But America just didn't hear a lot about her in the decades of the 21st century. She just wasn't nearly as prominent and visible, and much of that by her own choice. Now, she was healthy, and it was a surprise to all involved. And Trump, doubtlessly, the stories were accurate that he was put on his heels and in shock and mourned greatly her death. He didn't anticipate that. No one did. She wasn't sick at the time. She in 2022, she fell down a flight of stairs apparently in her home and had been left there for a long time. Could have been as many as 18 hours or so since someone last saw her until the time of discovery.
Just a total accident.
Yeah, an accident. So she was a confidant of Trump. They had a wonderful relationship despite the early years and the divorce and that. They ended up being friends, and Trump, of course, was at her funeral and et cetera. So we talked about some of this before.
She even liked Melania, but not so much that Marla Maples.
No, that was Marla Maples was, the fuse that ended the marriage. So now let's look at the estate of Ivana Trump. We've kind of set the stage. We've talked about her assets. We've talked about what's out there. We've given you a good feel for the dynamics in the family, good relationship with Donald Trump, good relationship with her kids. There was never any sign of animosity or conflict that at least the public knows of. And the children seem to, for the most part, they get along well. No public, and I haven't even read about any private spats. But still, it's important to look for those things when you're thinking about doing estate planning. You've got to consider those dynamics, those relational dynamics that are going to really determine the extent to whether your estate plan is ultimately fulfilled or whether it's thwarted, or worse, it just dies a slow death in the courts through continued conflict and people filing new petitions and new challenges, attorney fees eating up much of the principal of the estate, and that's the thing none of us want. That's kind of the nightmare scenario for estate planning. So the relationships here look like they're positive. There wasn't conflict on the horizon that you might often see even outside the family regarding business activities and other such things.
Which again makes me think that she, again, a great mother. because the kids get along so well. She probably taught them family values, like deep family. You stick up for one another. You are there for one another.
I completely believe that. I don't think that simply occurs spontaneously. I think that those sorts of things, they're either expressly communicated or they're modeled. And the fact even that the kids may have conflict, and I suspect there is some conflict between them.
That's family.
And I've even heard that they have some different political views. I've heard that may or may not be accurate, but I've heard that Ivanka, is more of a middle of the road moderate, and perhaps it's Donald Jr. or Eric, who's the
baby, the family,
the flamethrower among them in terms of being very conservative. I'm trying to recall, I think it's more Donald Jr., isn't it? That I see more prominently talking about, very conservative causes. I mean, he seems to be a true believer.
Yeah, and he's very vocal.
Yeah.
So he's out there.
Yeah. So, but anyway, those things can exist, and yet you can tell that these children perceive that it's not their job to go public with these things. As so often in America, it's almost like it's a virus that's out there, and people seem to think that it's their responsibility to go on some social media platform and air their views, that they have this moral imperative that they have to go to the world and find the largest audience they possibly can, which is usually some form of digital medium. But however it might be, they feel this obligation to tell the world about their particular opinions and why they believe they're right.
Yeah, and get all their likes, write a book deal, maybe get a little mini movie.
That's the financial side too. So I just I'm really encouraged when I see people who keep their views to themselves, and when it involves family especially. In other words, that sense that there's a higher obligation. We're not going to air our dirty laundry. We'll deal with this internally. And yes, I can have a disagreement, even a strong disagreement with my sibling and not feel that I have to go on X and tell the world about it.
Yeah, very respectful.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm not sure that our president follows quite that model. But,
who knows? We won't go there.
He has other good qualities. So
good kids for sure.
So here's what we know. We know that there was not a trust. We're reasonably confident there was not a trust. There's always, if you've watched this show, there's always a possibility because these things, there's no duty to make them public. But I could find no mention of a trust anywhere. I even tried looking up information about the law firm that represented her, which I couldn't find. And it tells me that there's been no proceeding or no filing with the public of records. And they usually file that in the probate court if they're going to file a trust, which you're not required to, but people often do that in order to give public notice that the trust exists in order to protect transactions that might occur with the trust, et cetera. So there are some reasons to do that, but clearly it's under the radar for the most part. Anyway, we didn't see a sign of a trust. And it's not inconsistent entirely with the larger pictures we perceive it surrounding Ivana. So Ivana had roughly $34 million at the time of her death. So this is what the probate records reflect. That consisted largely of tangible assets and financial assets. Tangible assets are real estate. So she owned this unit in Trump Tower. She owned
She had one in Miami Beach, St. Tropez.
Oh, yeah. She had the Miami Beach property. She had one in Czechoslovakia, right?
I don't know about that one. I just know that she had that New York City townhouse, which was also, sadly the one she passed away.
Yeah, yeah.
So
and then also, and there were properties in France, too. So now I don't know that the French or the Czech property, I don't know how valuable they were, but they definitely... They represent a substantial portion. All that real estate portfolio represented a substantial portion, more than half of the value of her estate. And then, of course, we have financial assets like securities, stocks and bonds and things such as that. Interestingly, there was no mention of any intellectual property. And intellectual property, we know, can be like name, image, likeness, brand. So those things were probably conveyed with the businesses that she had earlier, those that she didn't simply close, but that she sold, and they would likely have bought that intellectual property. And let's face it, at this point in her life, she probably didn't have a lot of that left in terms of ability to generate income through the use of her name and likeness. Probably less so toward the end of her life, even though her husband, continued to have this fame. In any case, there wasn't mention of that. It wasn't conveyed in the will, so I'm assuming it was given very little value. All of this, though, was conveyed through probate, remember, which means it came with taxes as well as, this publicity associated with what the distributions were. The distributions themselves were very predictable. We would have predicted that the 3 children would have gotten the largest share. We don't know how among the 3 children that the assets were allocated, but we do know that things such as jewelry and real estate, the securities, they would have gone largely to those 3 children. I see furs mentioned. And then to someone called Dorothy Curry, who apparently was the nanny of many years and her personal assistant.
Yeah, and the nanny, too, also to her dog. I guess took her dog, too. So
yeah,
Tiger Trump. So technically, she had 4 kids.
Okay, yeah,
if you count the fur baby.
Well, when you make provision for the dog in the will, that qualifies as one of the children.
Mm-hmm.
So she gave the Florida condo to Dorothy Curry. So she felt some loyalty to this lady who'd been with her for a long time. And the Florida condo, I'm sure, we're not talking about a $100,000 condo here. I wasn't able to look up the value of it, but I'm sure it's quite
like
a property.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's north of $1 million.
Yeah. And then she also tried to leave property to her 4th ex-husband, but he had already passed before her.
Yeah, and keep in mind that this was prepared in 2019. She dies in 22. So in 2019, her second divorced husband, her second former husband, they had this good relationship, which is another testament to Ivana. She maintains this good relationship with both. The one with the children, we think, okay, she has an incentive to maintain a good relationship with Donald. But this other person, and I shouldn't shortchange him here, Rossano Rubicondi. Rossano Rubicondi. And she had planned to give him one of the properties she owned in France, in Saint-Tropez, a beautiful area. And the only reason he didn't get that was he predeceased her. So it's what's called a lapse. So it means it goes into the residuary clause, which means it will be distributed to that place in the will at the end in which it says all other assets will go to so-and-so. And I'm telling you that the residuary clause, I'm sure, had a provision that those things go in equal proportion to her 3 children. So he didn't end up getting this asset, but only because he may,
He's already gone.
He's gone. So I was impressed to see she did that. And of course, she gave money to charity. Lots of clothing, and I'm sure the clothing was very nice.
And you kind of wonder about that. I mean, I know she was Trump's ex, but then, I mean, he is a president. So you kind of wonder if some of those clothes wouldn't end up in a museum as, the president's first wife kind of thing somewhere.
I don't think Melania would have.
No, but I could see there being a first wives club kind of thing. I mean, she was in that movie, and maybe there would be a museum that could have some of her clothing. That'd be kind of
if
interesting.
that museum happened, it would be over Melania's objection.
Probably.
And I even suggest strenuous objection. But they I think the reason they got along is really Ivana had no reason to feel resentment toward Melania because, Melania comes along later. It's different from the wife who took your husband. And often that's the scenario we see is where it's the person maybe the husband's having an affair with, they divorce, and then it's very uncommon for that ex-wife and that wife to get along, understandably.
Yes.
So, but this is a different thing with Melania, and I was glad to see that they had a positive relationship. So that's the distribution. Interestingly, the person that she chose to be personal representative was Eric.
The baby.
Yeah. And not the 3 together, but Eric alone. And I've read elsewhere, references in her biography also, but people have talked the fact that Eric was special in the sense that he continued a closer relationship and may have always had, as the baby of the family perhaps, always had a closer relationship with his mother.
And maybe she worried more about him too. Sometimes moms will be like, okay, one of my children need a little bit more help.
And
maybe that's what she thought.
And he might have been more of a peacemaker,
Yeah.
you know? Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is that's the person that often you would want in that role, the person who can referee, who can mediate, who can avoid conflicts between other siblings, and who is not likely to be drawn into a conflict themselves. In any case, he was chosen to be the personal representative, so he fulfilled that role. The estate stayed open for a while just because there were things to clear up, but there was no significant conflict in the estate. There wasn't a will challenge, a will fight. Mm-hmm. There wasn't any large creditor that came out of the woodwork to claim a large share of the estate, something that wasn't foreseen. There was none of that. The creditors were identified early, and that's really consistent with Ivana's life, where you didn't see her in the courts a lot. She sued somebody over using her brand. I remember reading this in around 2010. So there were a couple of times that she had to go to court in order to enforce, her intellectual property rights. But for the most part, she's not somebody who had a lot of conflict in her life, and she wasn't quick to go to court. Scout just came in, my faithful companion here.
Well, he was probably pretty excited about Tiger getting in part of the estate.
Well,
maybe he has a few words.
Well, Scout won't do quite as well as Tiger did, but unless I do as well as Ivana did, I doubt that's going to.
Maybe. There's still time.
So let's talk about the lessons of this estate. And remember, our objective in this show, when we talk about life's third act, as the name implies, is to think about not just the death, but that period toward the later stages of someone's life. So it's planning for both successfully. You don't want to end up in a situation where, you're without proper caregivers, where you're exploited, where you're living in circumstances that you definitely would not have wanted, where you end up consuming much of your assets unnecessarily and unintentionally. And nor do you want to end up in a situation where your estate plan itself, the things that you wanted to go to certain people in a certain way at a certain time, none of that happened, or if it did happen, it happened in a very expensive, wasteful, or partial way. So the whole idea is to pull off this last third, including death and beyond, to pull that off correctly. And so when we look at somebody such as Ivana Trump, we have to say, yeah, she did this well. But some things she did were not the way that, in a classical sense, someone would recommend that you plan that last third of your life. I mean, for most people, she kind of violated some of those rules, but yet for her, it worked out. So I want to talk about the things that she chose that are contrary to what we would recommend for virtually all of you and ourselves. And we'll talk about why those things pretty much worked out for her. And it wasn't simply a matter of luck, because it's of no value if it works out. It's simply a matter of luck. In her case, because of her unique circumstances, I kind of get why she did what she did. So let's talk about that. She had around, what did we say, $34 million was the estimate of the value of the probate estate. Because she did not do the trust planning she could have done, there were ways that she could have reduced her tax liability. We don't know exactly what that was, but we think it's around $7 million. Could have been more. So this is money that most of us would say, wow, that seems wasteful if you could have done things to avoid that entirely. And I'll go out on a limb here and say, without knowing some details I'd want to know, yes, she could have avoided that entirely, I'll say. But I don't think her lawyers failed her. I think she had great lawyers. I think that this was her set of priorities, because you do have to move some things around. It's inconvenient. It's not as if there's no hassle factor. There is a hassle factor. But the argument is, when you're talking about saving $7 million, or for some of you, if it were $1 million and your estate were $3 million, whatever it was, that's a lot of money. And And I would say that for anybody, the $7 million is. But for her, in her particular circumstances, I get the set of priorities she had. So I think she looked at the hassle factor and she said, I don't want to fool with it. Now, her reasons for doing that, I think, relate in a way to her beneficiary circumstances as well as hers. So you might say, why did she choose to go through probate, to risk all the conflict that can happen in probate? Probate is, generally speaking, more vulnerable than trust. She could have avoided probate entirely. We know that. Apart from the tax issue, she could have avoided probate entirely by putting assets in trust at the proper time, the proper way. But she also, as we mentioned, could have avoided taxes. So why didn't she do any of that? Why did she just say, we'll go through probate and I'll pay the taxes, whatever? Well, here's what I think was going through her head. I think that, number one, there was a financial self-sufficiency of her beneficiaries. So that's relevant for another reason that you do the trust. Another reason you want to do trust is you want to protect your loved ones. And I won't go through that long explanation here. Those who've watched the show know that a trust is a marvelous way to produce this fortress around the assets you give your loved ones. And it's better than getting them without the fortress. So you can get a pile of gold, or you can get a pile of gold along with Fort Knox that's going to protect it. And so she chose to not worry about those many protective aspects of a trust that she could have had for her loved ones. So when you look at all those factors and the fact that she chose just a will, no trust, even no trust that was created in the will, and to pay the taxes. So number one reason is that the financial self-sufficiency of her beneficiaries. I mean, her main beneficiaries were these 3 kids. And she looked at them at this time. She's preparing this will in 2019. These kids,
they're doing just fine.
They're doing just fine for a lot of reasons. And not just because of their dad. They're doing fine. They all have careers. They're all successful. So she knew that the self-sufficiency they had, she wasn't worried about the fact they were going to get $7 million less because of taxes. She wasn't concerned about the risks associated with dumping it in their laps. And then the low risk of conflict. As I mentioned, there's more risk of things occurring when you do things just in a will versus a trust between the parties. But there was low risk of conflict because she knew the relationship of her chief beneficiaries. So you take that off the table as a risk, and it's another reason to worry less about it. The financial sophistication of the beneficiaries. Now, this is not about self-sufficiency. This is about their ability to manage their assets. So these are people who, a trust will help manage the assets. So if your children are, let's assume they're very responsible and that they're self-sufficient, meaning they're making the money to live on, but you're going to give them $50 million, big number. So then you're concerned about, well, how financially savvy are they? So if I dump this in their laps, they can have good judgment, but it may still be, they just don't know, even though they're responsible people. So it's a different point from self-sufficiency. These were also kids who were financially sophisticated. They had spouses and they had relationships and partners, and they themselves had business degrees from Wharton and such places.
They weren't like 18-year-old kids. Yeah.
No, and they were older.
They had some life.
Yes, they had life experience in addition to those things. So you had financial sophistication of the beneficiaries. Marital stability of the beneficiaries. Another reason that you would worry about doing what Ivana did is something that I wouldn't do and I haven't done. But she felt, oh, well, this is the way I want to do it. So I'm making an argument, not that was the best decision, but that a rational, reasonable person could conclude what she did. I still, in her circumstances, wouldn't have done it that way, to be frank. I would have done the more standard advice. I would have followed that. But still, I see why she could rationally do what she did. And so that she saw the marital stability of the beneficiaries. And there was low existential business risk, the beneficiaries. Another thing that relates to what are they involved in as a profession? What are they involved in businesses that are high risk and subject to litigation claims and other things? So they were solid for the most part. They weren't engaged in those sorts of business practices and relationships. And then related to the above is just an indifference regarding the tax impact. That's kind of relating to all those factors is, Ivana just wasn't worried about the fact that the kids would lose this money in taxes. She knew it wasn't really going to affect their lifestyle in any way. But I will say this: there was an assumption of risk on her part relating to incapacity. So despite all the things I just said about reasons that someone in her shoes could rationally choose to do her estate planning the way she did, that it's not irresponsible. I want to make that clear, in my opinion. But I do think she assumed some risk that very well could have gone really bad. And that's that if you think that you could have a period of incapacity before you die, and we all could, It could be something that come on gradually, where maybe then you have a chance to do some planning, or it could be something that's traumatic. It could be something that occurs in an instant, such as falling down a flight of stairs in your mansion, in your penthouse in Manhattan. And it turns out that she died of that. She died perhaps in part because she wasn't discovered for that length of time. But that very easily could have been a situation where she became totally incapacitated to the extent that someone had to manage her affairs in her life and assure that she got proper care and that her assets were managed in such a way, all those things to occur. Well, you can have a durable power of attorney and a durable power of attorney for health care. And I will assume that being the wise person that Ivana really was, that when she chose to go this road, she knew that she had those in place. So she thought, look, if something like that happens to me, I at least have someone who has the power to make decisions. But it's not a structured power. So it's giving someone the ability to answer questions and do things, but it's not within the context of a scheme of rules and, the sort of guidance you can create in a trust, and for which, there's this whole infrastructure of laws to dictate how the money is managed and what the fiduciary does and the reports that they have to file, all those things that when you create a trust and you put in one of those provisions where, I'm going to run my own trust myself, which is what she would have done while she was alive. But the moment I become incapacitated, then immediately, just like that, no courts involved or anything else, the person number 2 below you, the successor trustee, immediately jumps in and takes control. And they're managing, they can just, without missing a beat, they can be managing your life. You've already you have in the trust already the assets, and you have the authority. The banks trust that authority. Other financial institutions trust that authority. So there's just much superiority in planning for incapacity through a trust than relying on this document, which is a durable power of attorney, coupled with a durable power of attorney for healthcare. It's a different document. Its focus is strictly on the person having authority to make decisions relating to your health, which is important. But I'm confident that Ivana had those things in place. I'm sure she did. But it was just a big assumption of risk. Now, as it turns out, she fell down those steps unhappily. It turns out that she dies in this way, so it never really came up. But we all know, and I don't have to persuade you of the probability that all of us will go through some significant period of time of that, whether it's a month, a week, or dare I say 10 years, 20 years. I mean, those stories are out there, depending on the illness and the injury or by whatever way that incapacity occurs. So I'm calling attention to that because, a good plan, again, is not just about the estate plan itself. So I really want us to note that when you choose to manage things without trust like that, particularly when you're in a position where there is a significant number of assets and a significant number of complexity associated with your estate, then it really is good to do that. But again, I think Ivana, made decisions thoughtfully, and I think she decided she would assume that risk, and she figured she was covered on a basic level with these durable powers of attorney, which that's safe to say on a basic level, that's true. So here's the reason that I think that Ivana is a wonderful role model in many ways, but the applicability is very limited. So we have to praise her and respect her, certainly. She was a great lady. But we have to realize that you can't quite do your estate planning in the same way I'm suggesting. And here's the things that really stand out to me. We say, how did Ivana end up with this relatively peaceful, smooth transition where there was very little drama in the last years of her life, very little conflict that the public saw, these harmonious relationships. Then she does an estate plan, which is really the focus of this show, is the estate plan, including the planning up to the estate, to the death. How she follows what she did and it works out for her. Well, here's some things to note. And there are things to note as role models for us too. We just have to note the limited applicability when we go see lawyers when we're doing estate planning. But still, I think these are praiseworthy. She had positive relationships, and she maintained those for decades with the key people in her life. You know, she so many times, particularly with celebrities, we just see it full of drama, bitterness,
Yes,
jealousy,
always.
anger, someone feeling like they're slighted, so they cut their children off because their children don't behave correctly, or someone takes offense. I mean, to have managed to have harmonious relationships closest to her, and all the evidence says that, it says something less about these people than about Ivana, because she seems to be the common denominator that she pulled that off. So she's simultaneously known as a strong lady, very, with a strong will and determination, quite self-sufficient, she proves. But, she has the ability to keep and nurture relationships.
Yeah, she's a survivor from everything from her childhood to the things that, to get her out of the country, to get her to America, all the things she did. She's a survivor, and she truly, taught her children to stick together, and there was like so much family there. But I do kind of wonder if she would have had children with anyone else, if things would be different.
I don't know. If it were up to her.
Because these are all kids that are completely related 100%.
Well, that's true. But and that's a point worth making. But just what I see with her relationships around her, I would bet she would struggle for that to occur. Meaning, if it didn't occur, it would be through no fault of hers.
Yeah.
And she also had harmonious relationships of these people with one another, which is the point you just made, is that she, whether we credit her with all of that, which is not fair to credit her with all of that, but certainly to credit her with some of that, and that's that one of the bases, two large bases of conflict in estate planning that often occur after the death, but normally you can see beneath the surface, what's going to end up breaking through after the person dies. You can already see the conflict while the person's alive, and that's either between the person and the children, and the beneficiaries, we'll say, the key beneficiaries, whether it's brother, sister, children. Usually you can see those sorts of simmering fractures before the death. But what's more impressive, or as impressive, is for there not to be conflict between those people. So on the one hand, we talk about her relationship with her key beneficiaries, but also the fact that the key beneficiaries, there's a relatively harmonious relationship among them. So again, I'm not crediting her with all of that, but it's fortunate, and I suspect it's not simply luck. I suspect that it's some combination of good fortune, but it's clearly also through, a skillful and principled life management.
Family tradition.
You need a little of both. Success in life, anybody who suggests to you that success in life is entirely due to someone's tremendous skill and self-discipline, et cetera, is not being fully truthful. And clearly, we all count on a little bit of luck, good fortune, call it divine help, which is probably what I would characterize most good things that happen to people. But there's also an element in which, these people contribute, and I think that needs to be there for the success that Ivana's had. So no one can call it just luck. So she had also, let me mention this third thing. There are relatively low levels of conflicts and dispute in her business and professional affairs. That's another avenue where, when you look at probate litigation, you'll find these three categories represent 85% easily of litigation in probate. And that's conflicts that existed already on the person who's deceased. Second is whether or not they had any conflict with the person who deceased. They may have all loved the person who deceased, but then there's conflict suits among the beneficiaries against each other, alleging different forms of misconduct, et cetera. And then finally, you have those third parties, those people who are not beneficiaries. They're professional and business relationships typically, which over time, there have been problems that developed, and those problems go straight into probate court when that person dies, and that's often where they really see the light of day, where things are alleged in claims and petitions filed with the probate court that may not have been said as expressly to the person who's now dead. So that is another area, substantial area of conflict that occurs in estate planning, and another thing you have to plan for and think about when you're doing your estate planning and your end-of-life planning. So relatively low levels of conflict and disputes. So again, I credit Ivana with some of this. I mean, people who end up in lots of conflict in their business world, usually there's something in them that elicits that. I'm not saying always, of course not always, but often that person walks around when they find themselves in a lot of litigation. I'm telling you, you have somebody who is unreasonable, somebody who is maybe a little disrespectful. It could even be to the stage of less than honest, but it always suggests that there's some problem with the person who is on the receiving end of lots of lawsuits. That's what I've seen in this world. And so in this case, it says that Ivana handled her professional relationships skillfully.
She chose well who was surrounding her.
Yes. Yeah, right. I think that's a big part of it. I think that she was a good judge of people. Mm-hmm. I think people, though, correctly judged her to be a lady of principle. And for the most part, her business relationships went well.
Yeah, I think maybe they were a little afraid of her. You know what I'm saying? She was a strong woman, and they knew she wasn't going to put up with anything.
And she had a scary ex-husband.
There you go.
Who would probably have come to her defense if asked. So in this sense, wrapping up here, Ivana is an interesting person to observe and to learn from, and I think that she, again, is a role model in many ways if you look at her life. But again, don't be too quick to follow her approach to her estate planning. It worked for her, but she had relatively unique reasons. Not many of us have those reasons. So I don't criticize the way she chose to do it. She did assume some risk regarding her end of life, but that worked out. So I have nothing but praise for her and respect for her. And I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that you've learned something as well. So this concludes our third and final episode on Ivana Trump. This has been Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
We hope you enjoyed Life's Third Act, sponsored by Cordell & Cordell, your advisors for estate planning and beyond. Subscribe and join us weekly for thought-provoking discussion and topics exclusively focused on estate planning and your financial future. Discover more at CordellCordell.com. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.